Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, and we host the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. I am delighted to welcome you to the first Hayden Center event of this academic year, Secrets, Presidents, and Dissent. We are very pleased to have General Hayden as a member of the Schar School faculty here at George Mason University, where he has been teaching for us for the past decade, and is surprisingly a very popular instructor in our International Security Studies Master's Degree program, which I suppose I should mention is our fastest growing graduate program here at George Mason University, and recently received a very high ranking from U.S. News & World Report as the number 3 program in the country, of which we're very proud. The great turnout for this event, I think, says a lot about the importance that many attach to the issues and problems our distinguished panel will discuss this evening. I would like to recognize some of the people who are here this evening. Congress member, former ambassador, and former Lieutenant Governor Don Beyer. Great. Thank you, Don. Several members of the George Mason University Board of Visitors are here. I will just read all of their names. Horace Blackman, Lisa Zuccari, Ignacio Moreno, and Edward Rice. And we also have a Board of Trustee member, Sumit Shrivastava. I also acknowledge the Associate Dean of the Schar School, Ming Wan, and Senior Vice President for Finance and Administration, J.J. Wagner Davis, will be here tonight. And the most important supporter of the Hayden Center, Mike's wife, Janine Hayden, who will be critiquing his performance tonight. Thank you. Although not here tonight, I gratefully acknowledge the vision, the continued counsel, and the support of the namesake of our school, Dwight Schar. And finally, I recognize a person who needs no introduction for most of us here. It has been my privilege to work with Mason's president, Angel Cabrera, for the past several years. He is the 6th president of George Mason University, and he is now in the 7th year serving in that role. During this time, George Mason University has achieved remarkable growth, outstanding rankings in many of its academic programs, transformational naming gifts for our law school, the Scalia School, and also for the Schar School, among many other accomplishments. So I'm now privileged to welcome our president, Angel Cabrera. Angel.
Thank you all very much, and welcome to George Mason University. As a short plug, you may like to know that this is the largest research university in the Commonwealth of Virginia and the youngest Tier 1 research university in the country. It's a really remarkable story of growth in a short period of time. But we also recognize, and we're very proud of this, as being one of the most diverse universities in America, and that's actually was recognized by U.S. News also today. And we always say diversity is our strength, but for diversity of people and ideas to be our strength, it's important that we engage in important civil conversations, and that we model, especially in today's world, what it means to have conversations on important issues and have them with people who may think differently from one. That's why I'm so excited about what's happening at the center, the Hayden Center today, and I hope that today serves as a model of the type of important, enlightened, civil conversation that we think ought to be the norm in our society. We're fortunate to have General Hayden as a distinguished visiting professor, as Dean Rozelle mentioned. And his ability to attract such an esteemed panel and audience demonstrates the reach and impact of the school and the role that it plays in reaching, dissecting, and explaining crucial issues. General Hayden, we're so grateful for the work that you do on behalf of the university. And I am pleased to welcome tonight United States Representative Don Beyer. who is serving his second term representing Virginia's 8th Congressional District. Congressman Beyer serves on the Joint Economic Committee and the House Committee on Natural Resources, and he's vice-ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee and ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee. He was, as you heard from our Dean, Lieutenant Governor, he also served as ambassador to Switzerland. But I want to thank Congressman Beyer precisely because of some very thoughtful and important comments for our university that he made last spring in a joint science subcommittee hearing on foreign plots targeting America's research and development. He spoke very eloquently about the need for colleges to increase vigilance on security protections, which we take very, very seriously. But he also underlined the fact that foreign talent and foreign scientists play an absolutely crucial role in strengthening the systems of research and innovation in this country. And we cannot take care of one problem without paying close attention to the strengths that we have in that regard. So we really appreciate those comments that you made. Representative Beyer is certainly no stranger to Mason. He holds an annual women's conference here on the Arlington campus, which is going to be repeated in this very room, as well as small business development events, and he's involved with Mason initiatives related to environmental issues. It is a pleasure to introduce to you Congressman Don Beyer.
Good evening. I am so fortunate to represent the 8th District, but especially to represent George Mason University. As a lifelong Washingtonian, I remember when this was Can's department store and how far it has come. And I think I can say with confidence there is no university in the United States, perhaps in the world, that has had the meteoric rise in reputation and capabilities as George Mason. So congratulations and thank you. I also want to point out to the intelligence professionals tonight that when I graduated from Williams College in 1972, the first thing I did was go to Roslyn and apply for a job at the Central Intelligence Agency, and it was turned away. So, we're very fortunate to be here at the Schar School of Policy and Government. And Dwight and Martha Schar have been dear friends for decades, and they have built tens of thousands of new homes through NV Ryan. But now they're helping to build a whole cadre of policy and governmental professionals who will help us govern well for generations to come. I feel very privileged to be here tonight to learn about secrets, precedents, and dissent at a most obvious crossroads in the history of that intelligence relationship. To be here with this distinguished panel with Generals Hayden, Clapper, Admiral Rogers, Director Mudd, and our moderator, Nicolle Wallace, I cannot imagine a more interesting place to be while we wait for Hurricane Florence to hit. And so thank you, General Hayden, for overseeing the creation of the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. Dissent is always uncomfortable for people in charge. It can cost you a point or a game in a tennis match. You can get ejected from a baseball game. You can be held in contempt of court. But dissent is essential in a democracy, especially the informed dissent of those most familiar with the issues before us. Well, General Hayden doesn't need much introduction. With nearly 40 years of public service, he served in a whole variety of positions throughout our intelligence community and all over the world. He served in the Air Force, retiring as a 4-star general. He had assignments in the National Security Council, the Air Intelligence Agency, the UN Command, U.S. Forces Korea, before being appointed director of the National Security Agency in 1999, and then director of the CIA, where he served from 2006 to 2009. So he knows quite a bit about the internal workings of the intelligence community, the accountability of the intelligence, on which the discussion will focus tonight. Before I hand over the stage to General Hayden, though, I want to take a moment just to remember the significance of this day, September 11th, its grave impact upon our country and upon our intelligence community. And we persevere 17 years later now, thanks to those who keep us safe. Our servicemen, our first responders, our intelligence community, and so many others. So thank you all for having me here tonight. Thank you to General Hayden and the director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer. I really look forward to this vigorous discussion, and I give you General Hayden.
Thank you very much, Congressman. President Cabrera, Dean Rozelle, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. This is the inaugural event of the second year of the Hayden Center. We spent last year talking about truth tellers in a post-truth world. And then Director Pfeiffer and I thought that a nice organizational concept for year two would be around the question of accountability with regard to espionage in a democratic society. And that still is our theme. And Larry and I had laid out a rather predictable course of events of things we would cover in the public events for the Hayden Center. And then there was that security clearance thing that happened. And so we decided that this might actually be a good opportunity to take advantage of that controversy, to take a look at the question of presidents and secrets and dissent. What are the proper bounds for that kind of activity in a free and open society? And so that's the topic here for tonight. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panel members and invite them to come up one by one. You've got some more detail in your programs because we really do want to get onto the discussion and, frankly, your observations and questions before we're all done. So let me first of all introduce Phil Mudd. Phil is a career analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the senior analyst in our Counterterrorism Center and living what he thought was a happy life until I called him one afternoon and said, Phil, I need you to go over to the FBI and set up their intelligence analytic structure. We remain friends. Mike Rogers, wonderful career in America's Navy, ended up the last several years of his career being the director of the National Security Agency and commander of U.S. Cyber Command. And the important thing about Mike's work there, he was in that latter position, U.S. Cyber Command, when all the metal is still malleable. He had a very powerful hand in shaping what it is that command will be for us in the future. Jim Clapper. Now, I could shorten my introduction for Jim by simply naming the important intelligence positions Jim has not held. But he has been the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He was on my board of advisors when I became director of the National Security Agency, and he's been the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And then our moderator or referee for tonight's discussion is a good friend of mine, Nicolle Wallace. We were compatriots in the Bush 43 White House, and as I think all of you know, she is now a regular and a commentator on MSNBC. Nicolle, we're ready for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Well, so much is made of how much all of you add, and Admiral Rogers, there's still time for you, but all the rest of you add to the conversation that we have about this moment in politics, this moment in national security by the roles that you have on television. And so just on behalf of everyone that gets to watch all of you and learn from all of you, thank you. I want to dive right in to where we find ourselves because we can never do much planning because there's always something happening in real time. And you gave us a guide with the name here, Dissent. You all signed a letter dissenting from the president's decision to revoke former CIA Director Brennan's security clearances, and I want to ask you about that letter, starting with you, General Hayden.
Yeah, I mean,
and let me just and Admiral, you did not.
Right, I did
we'll
not
come other.
sign.
You did not sign. I don't want to misspeak. We'll come around. I want to hear about that too. You dissented from the dissenters, but let me start with you, General Hayden.
yeah, that was actually a fairly easy call. Now,
Let me read a little bit of it too,
Sure.
in case people haven't, just to refresh everyone's mind. So you wrote in part, and this was on the president's decision to revoke the security clearance of former CIA Director Brennan. So you all wrote and you co-signed a letter that says, "We have never before seen the approval or removal of security clearances used as a political tool, as was done in this case. Beyond that, this action is quite clearly a signal to other former and current officials, as individuals who have cherished and helped preserve the right of Americans to free speech, even when that right has been used to criticize us. That signal is inappropriate and deeply regrettable."
yeah. So the issue frankly, I mean, to be very candid, I mean, the security clearance is a convenience for all of us, but it's given to us for the benefit of the government, not for us. I mean, none of us, you know, when I have a CNN hit, I don't go up 123, pull in the Langley, rifle my old files, take some notes, and go down and talk to Wolf Blitzer, all right? And frankly, the question of people like us who, well, 3 of the 4 of us are under contract to a major news outlet to talk on the air. I mean, it's a fair question. Should people like us continue to have security clearances given a role we have freely chosen? And that might mean we wouldn't do some other things, but that's a choice. And that's a fair question. That's not the question. That's not the action. The action was punishing John and threatening to punish 3 of the 4 of us on stage with losing our clearance for political speech. And we just thought that just, although this is a legitimate conversation over here, this was punitive action for political dissent. And although I don't think any of us would have enjoyed contesting any of this, given all the personal burdens that would bring, there was, in our view, this higher principle involved, that we would be denied something to which we would otherwise have been entitled, and that we were being denied it for political speech. And that's why it was actually pretty easy to get signatures.
Press you on this a little bit. A former senior intelligence official who's not as public as the 3 of you signed his letter to the name to preserve that principle you described, and felt that revoking clearances of a critic really walked up to a line of not being an American practice. Do you put that in the category of a practice that this president has engaged in that comes close to changing who we are as a country?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I mean, and Mike is just retired, but the other 3 of us, we were on TV for a while, all right? And I don't mind being on TV trying to explain American espionage to the broader American public. I think that's a public service. But because of the current circumstances, we're put in a position when we do what it is I just described, we seem to be pretty frequently in opposition to what it is the president or one of his surrogates have just said. We're not enthused by that. We're all made uncomfortable by that. Mm-hmm. And I think the issue that bites and is generally applicable, not just to us, is that the president as a person, the administration as an institution, doesn't argue the facts of the case. It attacks the character, legitimacy, and validity of the other side. And that I mean, look, I'm not saying that's never happened before in American history, but not to this degree, not to this almost reflexive response to any degree of criticism. And so, Nicolle, you and I were talking earlier. I wrote an article yesterday for The Hill, in which I said, I've kind of gotten myself to the position wherein in emergency break glass situation. And so we're doing things that we probably didn't plan on doing, we're not enthused about doing, but we're going to go do them.
Admiral Rogers, you dissented from the dissenters. You were out of government.
No, that's not what I would say. I chose not to sign a letter.
Okay. Do you agree with its... Fair enough. Do you agree with its sentiment?
So let me walk you through the thought process for me. First, as you've heard, I'm newly retired. I retired from the United States Navy as of June the 1st, so I'm 100 and some odd days into this new life. And as this was unfolding, I was struck by a couple things. First, I agree with the fundamental premise that it is the right of every citizen to express their views. I embrace that. And like everybody on this stage, have spent our professional lives focused on ensuring that right remains for all of us. I truly believe that's one of our strengths for a nation. But I had 2 things that gave me pause. The first, one thing the teams I've always been a part of, I always remind them, remember, it's always about outcomes. It's not about activity for the sake of activity. It's always about get to outcomes. And so I said to myself, is this going to be effective? And I just thought, so a group of former senior intelligence individuals complaining about how another former senior intelligence individual is being treated, I'm not sure is the most effective way to address a very valid concern. I applaud Admiral McRaven, for example. I thought what he did was truly professional. And I thought, hey, that was really effective. Someone who had no dog in the fight per se directly spoke up to say, look, there's a fundamental principle here I think we need to stand up for. I also thought pouring gasoline on a fire is not going to reduce the flame. And we got enough fires burning right now, guys. We need to focus on what are the outcomes we need to achieve as a nation. And remember, John and every one of us, with or without a clearance, retain the right to say what we want and do what we believe is the right thing. The last thing, and quite frankly, it's probably what prompted me to do this tonight. This is the first time I have done anything in which media has been there, since I've entered this new life and retired after 37 years as a naval officer. The other concern I had was, is this going to make the work harder of the men and women in the intelligence profession of the world in our nation today who are doing the job? And as a guy who was on the inside for part of this, who at times, being very honest, would say, guys, this is not helping. Because my concern is intelligence is most effective when the perception of the customer is that what they are seeing represents a true, objective, analytical assessment that is not in any way influenced by political view, administration, particular policy. And so for me, as I've talked to the teams I have led within my intelligence career, we must ensure that nothing we do calls into question the objective nature of intelligence. Because I've watched at times, and we have all seen experiences when that has been called into question, and we're thinking, you're not listening to what we're saying in the sense that, look, we think that something is very important here, but instead we're focused on, well, are you telling me this because you like this policy, you don't like this policy? And so for me, I just thought, I agree with the point the letter is making, but I am concerned that this won't be the most effective way to make the point. And number two, I'm concerned about what this will do for the men and women that are doing that work in the agencies that we have all been a part of. And as a result, I opted not to go this route, even as I recognize, John, anybody, you need to stand up and speak what you believe. I don't question that for 1 minute.
Can I press you a little bit, since you're the first one to, this is the first time anyone is hearing from you in this role, and you worked for Donald Trump. So let me ask you, right? Let me just follow up with something that General Hayden published yesterday.
Which I haven't read, so.
Well, that's good. We'll all be surprised together. I fear that the creator did not endow Trump with the emotional, intellectual, or ethical tools to carry out the responsibilities of his office. You saw him up close. He was your customer.
I am best served when I focus on the expertise that I have developed in 37 years. So you want to talk about national security? You want to talk, again, let me finish the thought if I could. This is an example of, for me, I worked for 2 presidents. You have never heard me talk about either of them. My view is each of them was trying to do the job to their best ability. Now, you can certainly have a different of opinion as to the how, the why, and I have my own opinions, don't get me wrong, which I share with my family and others. But I am just concerned, and part of this is part of the ethos, although 3 of us are senior retired military members. And part of that culture always said, remember, when you take the uniform off, particularly as a 4-star, it doesn't end. And you need to be very mindful. And I'm not trying to criticize anybody else. Look, everybody has to do what they think is right. And I did what I thought was right.
Let's put the uniform back on then. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. You testified under oath on Capitol Hill under some pretty intense questions from Democrats and Republicans that you had not been given the tools you needed to fight Russia, that you had not been given the authorization. I think I'll just read it to you here. That you had not been given the authorization you needed to sort of fight fire with fire was the sentiment. I believe Senator Elizabeth Warren was part of that questioning. Did that improve? Did you?
So I said I hadn't been given any additional authority to take
Did that
additional
improve between
action.
the time you testified and the time you left?
Oh, you can tell over time we were moving what I thought was a very positive direction.
Did that change? Did that change come from the top?
Oh, the leadership clearly was part of that because we're top-down in the sense of formally directing change that doesn't come from the bottom, it comes from the top, so clearly a part of that. And I was glad to see the broad direction that we were moving. I'm not going to pretend it for 1 minute, it's perfect by any stretch of imagination.
And you weren't alone. A lot, of course, FBI Director Wray testified that he hadn't been given all the authorities he needed. But did you see that as that improved over the?
Oh, yes.
Joe, Director Garber, let me bring you in on something that Bob Woodward reports that you said, and let you just say whatever you want to say.
Come on.
So he writes that I don't believe in human sources, Donald Trump told Clapper after he briefed Trump on Russian meddling. These are people, human sources, who have sold their souls and sold out their countries. I don't trust human intelligence and these spies. I don't have it here, but I believe Director Brennan said something like, I won't tell the team. How do you, just to pick up on Admiral Rogers' thought, how do you, and you've both a year ago talked about this idea that it is the job and the mission of the intelligence community to customize the intelligence product for the customer, who is the President of the United States, whoever he or she is. But how do you customize a product for a man who, quote, doesn't believe in human sources? These are people who have sold their souls and sold out their countries. They've done so to help our country.
Well, in fairness, this was a comment that the president-elect at the time made on exactly the 6th of January when, and he didn't make it just to me, it was all of us, Admiral Mike Rogers, John Brennan, Jim Comey. Given the remarks he made at Gina Haspel's installation at CIA recently, it would appear to me, at least the inference you could draw, is he's gotten smarter about it or gotten more educated about the value of human. But he did make a comment, something like that. Those weren't the exact words. We didn't dwell on it at the time. We just pressed on with our briefing. But again, this was 20 months ago, and the president-elect at the time had very little, virtually no exposure to intelligence at all. So I think this is, in fairness to him, it's kind of part of the education process. I have to say, that the interesting contrast here between Mike Hayden and Mike Rogers here, and I think it reflects that a decision whether or not to speak out as a former is a highly personal one. Mike Rogers, and I think it's quite understandable, taking the position he's taken, he'll get over it. But, having served in this administration, I think he's going to come at it from a different perspective. It was 23 years ago for me, 23 years ago this month, that I retired from the military in September 1995. I never thought, it didn't ever even occur to me, to speak out or go on television or any of that. But I came to the conclusion that we're in a very different place and a very different atmosphere right now. So what bothered me to start with was the characterization of how I actually got into it with the then President-elect, was his characterization of the intelligence community as Nazis. And I felt I had to speak up on behalf of the intelligence community, which I did. I called him, and amazingly, he took the call. And so all my thing was just defending and explaining the intelligence community. By the way, following a model set by General Hayden, who was tremendous for us when I was DNI in the aftermath of Snowden, because Mike could go on television, didn't have to get interagency coordination, and didn't have to consult with lawyers, and he could just explain things in a way that we couldn't. And I remembered that model, so it's kind of my turn, to defend the intelligence community. What bothers me the most is the institutions and values and norms and standards of this country that I spent a good 50 plus years in one capacity or another. I've toiled in trenches of intelligence for every president since John F. Kennedy. And when those are under assault, which they are now, I felt it was my duty, my obligation to speak up. Now, that's not without controversy. I get blowback from my own tribes, both military and certain seniors in the intelligence community don't think it's helpful. But again, I'll end where I began with this, and as you've seen tonight, it's between Mike Hayden and Mike Rogers, it's a very personal decision.
Phil, let me read you a little bit from this anonymous op-ed, which came from a senior administration official. We've all been senior administration officials and can tell you that there are a whole lot of senior administration officials, and it usually isn't the kinds of people sitting up here. But we don't know who this was. This op-ed came out the day after Bob Woodward's book came out, and together the two pieces created a narrative that suggested to, I think, the public that there are serious questions about the president's competence and fitness and how he carries about his job. I've seen some of your comments on TV. I'd like to read you a little bit and have you expand. We believe our first duty is to this country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. Given the instability many witnessed, there were early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would start a complex process for removing the president. But no one wanted to precipitate a constitutional crisis, so we will do what we can to steer the administration in the right direction until, one way or another, it's over. That's anonymous, writing in the New York Times last week. Patriot or coward?
Look,
That's the debate. I vote patriot, but I'm asking.
yeah, please, go ahead.
By the way, the only reason I'm here is Phil's here. I don't know what So one man's whistleblower is another man's swamp dweller. And so this is a classic where you
Isn't
stand.
the information good no matter where? I mean, the New York Times has a standard.
The point is, I think that for those who are Trump critics, this is a courageous thing to do, and to speak out, and to assure people that there are adults in the room, to use the cliche, that are looking out for the best interests of the country and are abiding by the Constitution and are not driven by loyalty to an individual. Having said that, there are the other camp that think this is or allege it's treasonous and disloyal and all that. I do think, depending on the position of this person, and I'm not convinced it's one person, but let's just say it is. Depending on the positioning of the person and their stature, it probably would have been more compelling that had he or she gone public, and then quickly followed by resignation, I think. I do think it won't take as long as it took us to find out about Mark Felt.
I hope not. But let me just challenge that. Why is it a tribal question about the president's fitness to serve?
Well, that's a tribal question, and people come out on a tribal
But this
basis.
was a Republican. This wasn't a political appointee.
Well, I don't think. Well, we can talk about whether the Republican Party has the traditional identity it's always had. I don't think it does. In fact, what it espouses now is upside down from what it's always been. So this is different tribal aggregation than we traditionally ascribe.
Phil?
I agree with Director Clapper. Now, let's be really clear here. There is not an allegation of illegality in that document, presumably written by someone who was not elected by the American people. It's a person's analysis of fitness for duty. The American people get to vote for somebody who they think is going to change the dynamic in Washington, D.C., and we get to say, I disagree with his judgment, his temperament, and his intellect. I think this person gets one shot. But at some point, if you're not elected by the people and you make allegations that don't involve something that crosses a line into illegality, my question would be, obviously I've said a few unkind things, minorly, about the president on TV. My view would be he is not fit for duty. That is not a legal judgment, and I've not seen anything from the special counsel that indicates that the president will ever be alleged to have conducted something illegally. So I want to know from the author, if you're going to undermine the president, maybe you get one shot, and I've said on TV that you should get one shot, but I do not believe you have the right long-term to try to attack a president who is elected by the people if you're alleging non-fitness of duty, but you don't cross a line to say, I've seen something that violates the law clearly, and like Mark Felt, I have to stay because this is a violation of the American Constitution. I didn't see that in the op-ed.
I guess if I could comment, be leery of living in a system in which everyone decides that which they're going to do or not going to do. I would urge anyone, stand up and speak your mind. Hold yourself accountable. But I just find this, guys, the power of the structure is the values of the institutions. And as a member of one of those institutions up until 90 days ago as an intelligence professional, look, we have got to uphold the values and the ethos. Even as others have different views and are engaged at times in behaviors that we don't like, we don't think represent norms, and we think are working against the structure. We have got to make sure that in the face of that, we are maintaining our professionalism, our ethos, our integrity. And like Phil said, you didn't get elected. If you feel you can't live with this, make a case, make an argument, use your rights as a citizen. Stand up and be accountable for what you believe in. But don't attempt this kind of resistance move, which to me just feeds this narrative, well, you can't trust the institutions anymore. I just think that's a bad place for us to be.
If I could make one comment to pick up on what the president of the university said, for every student out here who watches cable TV, watch what just happened in this audience with a group of people who say, I have a different perspective, and you used a word, I can speak about this civilly. The president of the United States had an opportunity. I'm not sure I should have a security clearance. I suspect the answer is no. I've not revealed anything to either Russians, Chinese, General Hayden, or anybody else. My point is the question would have been to DNI Coates or to DNI Clapper previously, if someone signs a contract with a media organization that might include commentary that's partisan political, should we have a standard policy that says that person declines further access to classified information? That's a fair question the president asked. I agree with my former supervisor and the man who destroyed my life, General Hayden. This is really uncomfortable for people like me who are told, whoever the people elect, you should get out and speak. But when I wake up on vacation, the President of the United States says, I'm going to threaten you after you say something I don't like. That, to me, transcends the requirement for an intelligence officer to stay quiet. I'm going to say, no, you're not. That dog don't hunt. It's a bigger issue than my responsibility to remain loyal to the ethos of the intelligence community to say, you're not going to tell me when I can speak when I didn't serve in the government for the past 8 years. That's not going to happen.
So what was your red line? I want to be, I watch all of you on TV. I'm very familiar with your body of criticisms. You believe the president is not stable enough to hold the nuclear codes. You believe that the president calling the intelligence community Nazis. You spoke out on January 6th, the day of that hearing, and we talked about why that might be. Might he be compromised by the Russians? Phil, you were one of his most none of you were partisan. You were all extremely alarmed by his conduct in office. So putting aside this sort of, he has a right to know who's criticizing him. What is it about his conduct that created the red lines that forced you all into the public space, starting with you, General Hayden?
Yeah. I've got deep disagreements with policy. All right. So post-World War II policy, frankly, in America has been based on a national consensus that on balance, immigration is a good thing. Is better for America than not. Second, that our alliance system is a national strength, not a drain on American resources. And finally, that the world's most powerful economy is generally benefited by more free rather than less free trade. He's challenging all those things. I got a right to argue about every one of those, all right? But in the argument, right, what the president has decided to do is rather than argue the facts of the case, which you cannot create B-roll for me, that shows the president arguing the facts of the case, right? Never. What he does is attack the institutions in government who might, for their own reasons, oppose this or that policy initiative. And he tries to invalidate. So intelligence officers are Nazis. FBI is in disarray or in tatters or whatever it is.
Deep state corrupt.
Yeah, the deep state is corrupt. There's a tweet today.
This morning,
this
7:18 a.m.
Yeah, well, there was
9/11.
Yeah, but there, I know which one you're pointing to, but there was another one that actually said the Justice Department under Eric Holder would be acting just like the Justice Department under the Attorney General today. Okay, and I actually responded to the tweet. I said, bingo. Okay? I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. He meant that as a condemnation of today's Justice Department. So the choice we have, all right, is number one, and here's, you asked what was the crossover point. The crossover point for me was, is my continued silence, or, this is going to come out wrong, over respect for the office? In other words, I would be so deferential. Is it creating the assumption on the part of others that that's acceptable or normal or an okay attitude to have? And that is really the argument I have with myself, Nicolle. Am I normalizing by my silence something that we should not consider to be normal? Knowing full well everything Mike just said is absolutely correct. Because when we go out, and just our being here is at a minimum non-traditional. And for a bunch of elders in our tribe, Jim, it's downright norm busting for us to be here. And so we know we are creating second and third order effects that are harmful to the institutions from which we have come. But I've made the calculation that silence is no longer acceptable. Now, each of us in our own way choose our own formula with regard to how we criticize. And by the way, John Brennan would be here tonight if he hadn't been in Korea. And John has been the most forward-leaning, and I think calling it personalizing the attacks on the president. But we all enjoy some flavor of that at one time or another. So there's certain choices to be made along the scale. But I think those of us who have criticized have made the choice. We're willing to accept the risk to institutional norms and values in order to do something. Back to my earlier metaphor, in emergency, break glass.
Are you breaking the glass?
Yeah, no, I mean, for our tribe, yeah. The fact that 3 of us are under contract to CNN is in itself an offense to MSNBC.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. We're good. We all benefit from your voice.
But no, seriously. I mean, Jim and I were out in Reston 2 or 3 weeks ago with the tribal elders and having a conversation of this is a retired, very senior retired community, and let me just say there were a range of views. I mean, some were very supportive, but there were others here who just thought we should not be there at all. And that's not an illegitimate point of view. It's not mine,
right.
But it's not illegitimate. Jim, I mean, you were in the room.
No, I'm with you. That's exactly, as usual, very articulate portrayal of the debate, the issue, the controversy, and where you come down on it is a very personal thing.
What is your degree of alarm about Russia and about the ongoing sort of practice of the president downplaying their role? There's the Helsinki moment. I think you all spoke out publicly around that with your alarm. But the thread for you runs through what you knew and were involved in government. You briefed the president on the 6th. You were there too, Emma Rogers. I mean, the Russia thread has not improved. I'm glad to hear that we're doing more than maybe on February 27th, but that is not an impulse that's been checked. He stood in Helsinki next to Vladimir Putin and accepted his version of events.
Well, Nicolle, this is a great opportunity for me to plug my book.
Plug away.
Because, I mean, it was one of the principal motivations for, which I wasn't gonna, writing a book was my alarm about about the Russians and what I saw them doing in the run-up to our election in 2016. 55 or whatever it's been years in Intel, and I've seen a lot of bad stuff in my time, but nothing that disturbed me more viscerally when I came to comprehend, understand the scope and magnitude and aggressiveness of what the Russians did to our election. And of course, I went so far in my book to say, because of the magnitude, aggressiveness, and the multidimensional nature of what they did, I think they actually influenced the outcome of the election. And the Russians are still at it. They are committed to undermining our system. And one of the things that really disturbs me is, for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, but the president's failure to dime out Putin and dime out the Russians for what they're doing. And that is important because we can do a lot of things, components in the government can do a lot of things, but without the sense of urgency that's impelled by the president's leadership and galvanizing not just the government, but galvanizing society against the profound threat posed by the Russians. And that's what disturbs me about this president, and it's why I wrote my book.
Admiral Rogers, can you either tell us if you agree that he's refused to dime out Putin? Is that a fair assessment? And do you have any explanation?
Well, I'm not going to speak for anyone else. I'll give you my experience. So I continued for 18 months after we finished the Intel community assessment on this topic and continued to discuss with him and others about what we were seeing. He would often say to me, Mike, I'm in a different place. And I said, Mr. President, I understand that, but you pay me. I am paid by the citizens of the nation to tell you what we think. Sir, this isn't about politics. It's not about parties. This is about a foreign state that is attempting to subvert the very tenets of our structure, that is trying to undermine us. That should concern us as citizens. That should concern us as leaders. And if we don't do something, they're not going to stop. The first time this occurred was in 2016. We just saw it taken to a whole new level. A whole new set of technologies and capabilities merged with some pretty traditional kinds of things that had an almost exponential impact in some ways, at least in terms of the breadth of the kinds of activity. I do believe, hey, look, there is value in having a relations with the Russians. There's lots of areas where we have commonality. I believe that. But at the same time, I also say, but we can't have the relationship we want if they're going to continue with this fundamentally undermining activity. That is unacceptable, and we need to be very direct with them that that is unacceptable. And we should be sending that message from the top to the bottom of the structure so that they're hearing it from all of us.
You said he was in a different place. Where was he?
That was a phrase that he would use
But
with me
I mean,
one time.
where-
I actually
do
said,
you-
I'm at a different place, Mike, than you are on this. I
Didn't
said,
ask him where he is.
I understand, yeah. I didn't ask him where he was. I didn't ask him where he was.
But I'm not being facetious. I mean, was it ideological? I mean, he wanted to do some geopolitical realignment and
Well,
I mean,
I'll hazard a guess. Mike can, he's more current than I, but I think the reaction we ran into at Trump Tower in January of 17 was this evidence of the Russians undermining us casts doubt on the legitimacy of his election. And he just can't, he couldn't then and he can't now accept that. I think that's fundamentally what this space he's in.
so then with that as a lead-in, how important is the Mueller investigation?
Well, it's hugely important because of the cloud that's over this country and over the presidency, to resolve some issues, one of which is collusion or not, that I think only the Mueller investigation there's any prospect of resolving that issue. And that, at some point, that investigation has to end, and there has to be, I believe, some transparency for the American people about the truth.
Phil, how important is the Mueller investigation?
I think it's a critical test for whether America says that we can have independent investigations of individuals regardless of where they are in society. I don't think it's going to lead to charges that indicate that the president was involved in something nefarious related to the Russians. I don't know about whether that involves people on his staff. What I worry about is not whether the investigation is going to show that somehow there was some sort of Hollywood undermining of the American electoral process. What I worry is twofold. One is someone who served at the FBI and the Department of Justice. This is an appropriately predicated case. What I mean is it's fine, given what I've seen, for the Department of Justice to investigate this. It's the same thing they would do with somebody like me. Were you involved in massive financial fraud that should be investigated? Same thing that Paul Manafort should be investigated for. So I'm afraid if there aren't Russia charges, there's going to be a political process to say the whole investigation is inappropriate. And I'd say it's the same thing we do with all of you if we saw that kind of financial fraud. You defrauded the U.S. government out of millions of dollars. Is that insubstantial? And the final thing I'd say, my bigger concern is if the investigation gets closer to the White House, or even if it stops now, if the president steps in and says, I'm going to sidestep this process to remove, what's the term I'm looking for my son-in-law or my son or for Paul Manafort to pardon them. I think that will be incredibly corrosive in terms of a conversation with the Congress and also in terms of how the American people look at something that they have historically looked at it very positively. That is justice impartial in this country? Is the FBI a good place? I think that's the real question here. The president is leading the American people to believe that institutions of state are corrupt. I don't care about what he did with Stormy Daniels. This stuff about institutions of state is really corrosive, and that's what I worry about.
Director Hayden, you all worked alongside Bob Mueller. I got to know Bob Mueller after 9/11. He was George W. Bush's FBI director, and he would be coming out with Director Tenet when the press officers would go in. So George W. Bush used to say, I get the scary news and then the bad news, the intel and then the press. But I want to know what you think, all of you, knowing the man personally, what you make of the ferocity of Donald Trump's efforts to malign the character of Robert Mueller.
So I'll begin with my view of the character of Robert Mueller. If I had a choice among 330 million Americans as to who I wanted to entrust what Phil, I think, correctly described as the future of confidence in American democracy, it'd be Bob Mueller. All right? Honest, thorough, professional, talented. All right? And so he's continuing the course of the investigation. When this began, when I was, perhaps even with you on air, a year and a half ago, I said, I think it would be over by the summer of 18, wrong, and that it would end up in a national Rorschach test, that it would be a bit of a cloud, and those who wanted to believe X would say, you see, and those who wanted to believe Y would say, you see. It's gone on longer. Right. I think it's expanded. I think it's gotten deeper. I think it has multiple threads. And I, frankly, with no knowledge, no data, I think there's more there than I thought there was 6, 12, or 18 months ago.
On the collusion question and the obstruction question?
A variety of questions. And I think Phil's instincts are mine, that not the president per se, but the broader staff is going to have a lot of tough questions to answer to. I think the last indictment of the 13 Russians from the GRU was establishing the predicate for a criminal act, which then we'll see whether or not we connect any Americans to the criminal
Someone on the Trump
enterprise.
campaign or...
Right. And so as that is proceeded, again, my instinct, no data, all right? My instinct is that the president has acted more and more desperate, more and more frightened by the prospect of the investigation continuing. And so he's doubled down on his attacks on the person of Bob Mueller and on the institutions that Mueller represents or is guiding. And whatever you think, the sum total of what he's done is for his transient personal or political needs, and we'll judge how legitimate they are or not, that's actually not critical. For his transient personal or political needs, he is willing to embrace long-term destructive action against critical institutions of American society.
Admiral Rogers, you were asked in March of 2017 by the president, it's been reported as such, you'll let me know if it's wrong, to publicly deny, you and DNI Coates were asked to publicly deny that there was any evidence of collusion. You refused to do so, saying it was inappropriate.
I was never asked that.
So that was an incorrect press. You were never asked
I
by
was
the...
never asked that. I am not going to correct. If I spent my time trying to correct media reporting, I'd never get anything done.
So this has been reported and has stood incorrect until tonight. But it was also reported that, according to the Washington Post, Trump's conversation with Rogers was documented contemporaneously in an internal memo written by a senior NSA official.
No comment.
So no comment, but not saying that that's not...
No comment.
No comment. Do you think that Robert Mueller's mission is noble?
I think he's fulfilling an important mission for us as a nation. I'd like to think it shows that we are a nation of laws and processes and structure that are designed to ensure an independent assessment at times I look at it and go, that's a good thing for the nation as a whole. I have no clue what they will or will not find. No clue.
But
Everybody's got opinions. I hear lots of opinions, but I'm thinking, I think the only person that really knows are those who are involved. Let's let the process go through and let's see what comes out of it.
You've testified under oath, though, that you were worried that we were not doing, you were asked, you said you're concerned as I believe that President Putin has come to the conclusion that there's little price to pay here.
Right, we're talking about cyber activity
Right,
specifically.
right. And that was his method, one of his methods for meddling in our
Right,
democracy.
it was one of the tools that he used.
And you went on to say, clearly, what we've done hasn't been enough. Was it your sense that his efforts were ongoing, Putin's?
I've lost the thread.
So
I
your
apologize.
testimony was that you're
Don't worry my
concerned-
testimony, just tell me in English what you want me
Well,
to
I mean, you
ask.
testified to the fact that Putin didn't believe that there was a price to pay for ongoing
Right,
meddling
right.
in our democracy. That seems to be an area that may overlap with Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian
I don't
meddling.
know if it does or not. I'm not inside
But
the
is
investigation.
getting-
I don't have a clue what specifically he's looking at.
But is getting to the bottom of Russian meddling and whether or not it's ongoing, is that an urgent American?
Well, that's a positive for us as a nation. We need to understand this. We need to be very public about it, and we need to articulate exactly what happened, because without that, we will be sub-optimized for dealing with it in the future. And the important thing to me is, as much as important as the discussion has been about did they or didn't they, the most important thing to me is, so what are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? That's where we need to focus.
What's the answer?
What are we going to do? Oh, a whole host of things. There are some improvements, there are some things ongoing, but among the most important is to make sure the Russians understand this is unacceptable and we're just not going to tolerate this.
Do they hear that message, this is unacceptable, we're not going to tolerate this, from the American president?
I don't know, I'm not party to his direct conversations. Clearly, though, at times he has chosen not to use public forums. At times when he's been right there with them, he could have chosen. He opted not to. Again, you heard me say we need to synchronize the message from the senior-most to the junior-most, and we need to make sure we are very consistent. We need to be very direct with the Russians.
Do you believe, so you're saying it's not true that the president asked you to convey that he did not, that there was evidence that he colluded?
I've never had a discussion with collusion with the President of the United States.
How about with his chief of staff, Reince Priebus?
I have never had a discussion of collusion. I have never been directed to do anything, coerced. Any time I had a discussion, I felt I was able to say, hey, here's my view on that. I'm very comfortable.
If you were asked to share that information with Robert Mueller, would you or have you?
If I was asked by Robert Mueller in the course of an investigation, of course I would.
Do you understand sort of the freak out that people that don't know everything you know about national security had after Helsinki? I mean, do you understand why people thought? I mean, we talked before about how you were in rural Pennsylvania and they don't have the concerns we have in Washington. Do you understand the concerns in Washington?
I said that they weren't as,
Yeah, no, that's
the conversation we had afterwards.
I get it. My mom and dad aren't either. But I'm just asking you, do you understand sort of the degree of alarm people have when an American president takes the word of Vladimir Putin over the collective assessment of his
I
intelligence?
thought there was an opportunity there that I wish we had taken advantage of. I thought there was an opportunity here that we could have taken advantage of. Now, he opted to go a different direction. That's certainly his right as the president, but I wish we had taken advantage of that opportunity. I thought that could have sent a very powerful message.
Director Coates, DNI Coates, said that he would not have advised him to have a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. Would you have?
I don't know. It would depend on the specifics. Look, in general, I'm a proponent of talking. So again, I'm not going to get into what ifs, different scenarios. I've never found that very fulfilling.
Do you worry about the threat on Russia being lost as we walk up to or within almost 60 days of a midterm election? Do you worry that we've missed opportunities, as Admiral Rogers, who's the most recent to leave government, just said?
Well, are you speaking of specifically with respect to the security and sanctity of our election process and all that?
All of it, the entire American
Yeah,
posture against Vladimir Putin.
I do worry about that because remembering that our voting apparatus is basically controlled at the state and local level, and I'm sure some entities have done a lot to enhance the security, and others not so much. That was certainly what we observed in 2016, and again, in the absence of assertive leadership, which I think can only come from the president. So I have concerns about just the security and the sanctity of our voting apparatus for the midterms.
Well, in particular, and I guess I put that question to you because you make the distinction, General Hayden, in your op-ed, that you didn't come as far as you did in terms of your assessment of the 2016 results. You believe that the 2016 outcome was impacted by the Russians in Donald Trump's favor. So we're heading into a midterms. Has enough changed since that election?
I don't know. I'm not in a position any longer to assess that. I'm been out of the government happily for 20 months, but I would surmise from what I read that it is uneven. I'll put it that way.
Admiral Rogers, is it your sense that America is doing more or less under President Trump than they did under President Obama to protect our democratic process?
I'm not going to compare two presidents that I served.
Not but just policy.
I'm not
Is
gonna
the
compare-
NSA doing more or less?
I'm not going to compare the policies of two presidents I served.
Is the NSA doing enough to preserve and protect and vouch for the sanctity of our
Was I
electoral
comfortable with the mission execution while I was there? Yes.
And you'd vouch for the sanctity of the result in 60 days?
Vouch for? I don't
I mean, do
understand the
you
question.
think that we are sufficiently fortified against Russian meddling in the upcoming election?
Again, it depends on the specifics. The positive side is a recognition of the problem. Part of it also highlights one of the challenges of our current structure versus technology. What do I mean by that? In the US structure, elections are processes that are only done at a state, local level. And they then generate, in some cases, national outcomes. Presidency, for example. One of the challenges I thought was, so you tell me how you expect a county, a state, to withstand the focused effort of a nation state. That is a tough challenge. And so I thought one of the things that, and I was a part of it, I tried to work on, it's something I still feel strongly about. We have got to figure out how we can come to much more integrated approaches to how we're working these problem sets. And this is where, to me, at times, our structure, our processes are not always optimized for the digital world that we're living in now. And you watch the Russians, for example, take advantage of that as part of their strategy. And we need to try to fill in those seams, but it's all about bringing together integrated solutions to problems. It isn't just, hey, government, stop this from happening. That isn't going to be enough.
So it's a structural impediment, not a political.
In part. Now, I'm not going to argue it's just the one, but there's a definite structural piece to this as well that we need to be paying attention to.
General Hayden, can you give me your assessment of where you think we are policy-wise as a country heading into the first election, since the 2016 election is still under investigation by Robert Mueller, by others that are looking at and trying to improve our defenses against Russian meddling, and we still have a president who often lumps fat people in basements and the Chinese into his suspect list for meddling.
So let me answer the question you asked Mike, and he felt uncomfortable answering, because I've been out of government 10 years. Okay? I think I still have my pension. So, I actually think we are better defended under the Trump administration than we were under the Obama administration. And it's simply because of a natural progression of the institutions of American government, NSA, CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, standing on the shoulders of their predecessors, taking lessons learned, taking what it is we've experienced. I mean, Jim, I'll invite your comment on this, but you said this was an unprecedented attack, and as it evolved in front of you, you were very, very impressed by it. But it evolved in front of you, and your knowledge about it developed. And then the policy guys were lagging even further behind the intel guys in appreciating what it was you were telling them. We're beyond that now. We know that. And so
Well, Mike's exactly right. And I think it does point out something about misapprehension or illusion about intelligence, that all revelation occurs in one day. And that wasn't the case at all. I mean, this is something that, because an FAQ I get, frequently asked question, when did you know? When was the exact instant when that light bulb went on and you knew this was different than anything the Russians ever done before? Well, there wasn't any grand revelation when the light bulb suddenly went on, because it's something that evolved, particularly through the spring, summer, and fall of 16. And as we gathered more information, got more insight, understood better the magnitude of what they were doing. So I think to Mike's point is exactly right. The system is going to build on that knowledge that we built when we left. In fact, that was exactly the reason why President Obama ordered up the intelligence community assessment, because he wanted everything we had at the time to be put together in one document in several versions, various degrees of classification, one of which he specifically directed, was that there be an unclassified version, to do as much as we could to educate the public. So we left a baseline of knowledge with the public about what the Russians had done. So I think Mike's exactly right. Undoubtedly, the institutions, the community, Department of Homeland Security particularly has, I'm sure, built on that.
No, let me
Both
just say
of
one
you.
thought,
Go
Phil,
ahead,
and then, and so what you've got are the institutions of government. I got it, and everybody is doing far more than they did in the summer of 2016, because we're learning institutions, right? I think we're doing less than we need to do, because without superseding extraordinary presidential intervention, saying we got to go play different, everybody's doing what they're doing, but they're playing position. So NSA is playing in the NSA lane more robustly, CIA lane more robustly. But a little bit like 9/11, it's a bad day to bring up the analogy, and I know it falls apart very quickly in destructive power. But after 9/11, President Bush, in essence, intervened and said, we're going to go do things really differently. Now, a lot of those are controversial. We'll probably have that in the later session, all right?
But one of them was
we're
connecting the
doing
dots.
different.
Connecting the dots.
Right. We're going to restructure how we do things, because we just got an attack from an unexpected direction against a previously unappreciated weakness. And so we are better off, but we're not as well off as we should be, because I don't think we've gone extraordinary. Now, I want to make a point and tee up something Phil and I have talked about in the green room. You asked the question about manipulating the election. I don't think that's the big issue. I think we can defend against that. It's manipulating our heads, all right? And the Russians have been magnificent at that, building on inherent American division. So you talked about this when we...
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're missing the story here, and this is where I don't think this is an intelligence story. This is a political and leadership story related to the White House and the Congress, and that is, if you look at what the Russians have done, we keep talking about protecting the American electoral process. This is a revolutionary leader in Russia that wants to reestablish the empire. He's about sowing discord at a profound level in our society. You're talking about Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Charlotte. He is trying, if you look at their activities, at a sort of mid-tier level, if you will, to disrupt elections. At the macro level, he's trying to create a civil war in this country. That's where I think the White House needs to interject and not only not put fuel on the fire, say, look, we are an American people who want to be a city on a hill. We have to get over discord and talk about things like, how do we get beyond Charlottesville, and how do we get beyond racial divides in this country that involve having a black kid shot in a white neighborhood by a white cop? That's what the Russians are trying to do, and it is profound.
How do we do that with a president that wakes up on 9/11 and attacks the FBI?
I mean, one of the questions is, and it's a question I've raised repeatedly on TV, is you have congressional leadership. They don't have to attack the president, although that's a debatable question from people like Speaker Ryan. I do think there has to be a conversation that says, how do we bring people together instead of encouraging people to demonstrate against somebody else in Charlottesville, Virginia, and saying that a white supremacist equates with a black activist? You can't do that, and the Russians are building, I'm going to get personal. I have a website, it's a third-tier, low-budget website. If the information, the emails I get from across America that are threats are any indication of what's going on in this country, and the volume is such that I think they are, we are in trouble, not from disrupting the American electoral process, but from people in cities across this country hating each other. That's what the Russians are trying to go after. I think the subtext is electoral discord. Our overarching message is we want America to be so consumed with civil discord that they don't care about what we do in Ukraine.
Admiral Rogers, what do people in the press, including your peers here, get wrong in their analysis and, in my case, reporting on this president?
I don't know, to be honest, again, I literally have spent 100 days trying to focus on my family and getting some sleep. I have paid little attention.
But is there anything out there about
paid little
he has a
attention.
reputation for not being a voracious consumer of his PDB. He has a reputation for not being curious about foreign policy. Are there narratives out there that you're aware of that people get wrong? You're coming fresh out of serving him in a very senior role in a national security
I would
agency.
just say he approaches this job, and having worked for two presidents, he approaches his job in a fundamentally different way, having come from a totally different background. And the system is finding it a challenge to try to understand some of the implications of that. So what is most effective with him versus others? A very normal kind of thing. It's as much to me the system trying to understand him as it's him trying to understand the system. And as a leader, I would sit down with my team and say, okay, so here's what we need to be effective. Here's what I think helps provide the insights that help generate better policy, better general operational decisions. And we got to realize different individual, different structure, different background. He's going to approach things very differently. But as I look at this, at times I go, boy, the system just finds this really challenging. Now, certainly as we've said, the thing that concerns me the most is our institutions are under attack, which I always thought that's the strength of our system. It's the fact that we can count on these institutions, their ethos, their professionalism, their commitment to the rule of law over time, regardless of the broader context that's ongoing. That has been a real strength for us as a nation. And man, I just do not want to lose that because there's huge implications for us if you can't trust the institutions that execute the day-to-day mechanisms of governance for our citizens. That puts us in a really bad place.
But they're under attack in part by the president, no?
What we're seeing to me is there's a broad, it's an interesting dynamic we find ourselves in right now. It's not just about one individual. In some ways, it's somewhat symptomatic to me of a broader kind of dialogue that's ongoing. And again, you mentioned it. I literally have spent 100 days totally outside of D.C. In some places, I had no Wi-Fi access, spotty cell phone, didn't watch cable television. And it's interesting to me, one of my takeaways was I just thought, wow, is the dialogue I'm hearing in some of the rural areas I found myself for the 100 days different than the world I've just spent? It's not good or bad, it was just fundamentally different.
The answer is yes.
In many ways. I just thought, why? Part of me was asking myself, why is it like this? Why is this big disconnect? I mean, for example, the op-ed piece, I didn't once have a discussion with anybody, hey, Mike, they all know what my job was. I've known them for years, family, friends, others in the couple small towns where we were. They've known me for years, but nobody asked me. On the other hand, I've been back in D.C. for 48 hours, and I haven't done an interaction where this didn't come up. What do you think it is? What do you? And I'm just like, it just strikes me as a little bizarre.
To turn the question around, to protect those institutions, what would be helpful? I mean, would it be understanding that they are the thing on the line between where we are now and things getting better or worse? And would it be helpful if the president stopped attacking the intelligence community and the FBI?
Number one, I always told the teams that I was responsible for, guys, let's focus on the things we control. Let's make sure that we are maintaining the ethos and professionalism and the expectation of the citizens of this nation. I'm not going to spend my time worrying about things I can't control. Let's focus on what we can control. Then as a senior, I would try to argue, look, here's broadly the things I think we need to do to keep moving forward. And one of the things I think we need to do is ask ourselves, so how can we strengthen these institutions? How can we make sure that they're viewed as part of the solution and not part of the problem? Because if they're viewed as part of the problem, guys, this is our structure. If we don't believe in the structure's ability to generate the outcomes we want, we are really in a hurt locker because we don't have much of another alternative. This is the structure that the Founding Fathers created. This is what we have done over time. This has helped to generate some great things for our nation. It is not perfect. And the men and women who are part of it are not. perfect. But in my experience, they want to do the right thing for the right reasons, and they focus on trying to serve the citizens of the nation to the best of their ability, even as they acknowledge they are imperfect individuals. That's the part I want to see. How do we keep that moving forward?
You and General Mattis and General Kelly and a handful of others are often described by people outside of government who, some of us don't even know you, but we project onto you this faith that you are the guardrails against a reckless and unstable president.
I don't know that I'm a Secretary of Defense or that
But
I
how
was
do you feel about that analysis and that, I mean, it comes from a place of fear and desperation that we want to believe people like you and General Mattis and others are guardrails on this president. How do you feel about that analysis?
I never felt I was a guardrail. I always thought, Mike, always focus on doing the right thing for the right reasons, the right way. And as long as you do that, and you're part of an ethos in the teams that you lead. For me, the largest intelligence organization in the U.S. government, one of the 10 senior operational commands in the DOD. As long as you focus on that, as long as the teams focus on that, as long as we focus on outcomes and doing the right thing the right way, hey, we're going to be good.
Actually, I think that's probably emblematic of the IC in general. I mean, if you're an Embassy X doing your thing, you're just focusing on your job, your mission. And there are big parts of the intelligence community aren't affected at all by any of this, beltway fervor that Mike didn't run into in Pennsylvania. And, I think, I have great faith and trust and confidence in the men and women, the great men and women in the intelligence community, because I think in the end they're going to do the right thing, and they're going to tee up. They're going to tell truth to power, whether the power listens to the truth or not.
General Hayden, does the ethos that Admiral Rogers described extend to this White House in your estimation?
Well, to the professionals in the White House, I mean, I've written about this. We've got a president who is instinctive rather than thoughtful, prone to action. Frankly, I think he has far more confidence in his instincts than he does in data presented to him. He gives confidence to a particular conclusion more often based on who told him rather than the evidentiary stack that's underneath that particular conclusion. And then the problem that presents for all of us is the institution we represent operates on the polar opposites of what I just described for you. All right? Evidence-based, fact-based, analytical, experimental, pragmatic. And we have a president, and this is not I'm trying to use non-judgmental words here, who is instinctive, intuitive, almost preternaturally confident in his own a priori knowledge of how the world works. And so Mike talked about, we adjust all presidents, and we do, all right? This is a much bigger jump than it's ever been within my memory. But our responsibility, I think, as Jim said, is try to adapt, tell truth to power, and do it in a way that gets inside the head of the first customer. And that does require, look, I had to adjust with President Bush. And I had President Obama's CIA chief for 3 weeks. He's different. And I had to adjust how it was I talked to President Obama. We have to adjust to President Trump. But again, the
So it's
speed
tough
bump
dealing
here
when you're
is
serving a stable
massive
genius. That's
compared
the
to
problem.
compared to past presidents. And so your specific question was how the president affects that? Yeah. The president makes it harder for the institutions to do these jobs. No president wants unwelcome news. Right? I think this president is more unwelcoming with regard to unwelcome news than any president in memory, which then causes us not to abandon our oath of office, but to delay going in there with information he would otherwise get, because it's not going to work until you've built up a stack of evidence that is almost unarguable. And so what happens is the information you can give to a president in a time that is in time for the president to take responsive action is reduced. And so I argue that the president's approach to this, the president's words about intelligence, the president's attitudes about intelligence, is destructive for the purposes of the president.
The presidency.
To the presidency, not just to our tradecraft.
Let me press you on that a little bit, and I want to hear your thoughts on this too, Phil. I mean, let's be a little more blunt than that. It's not just that you stare at a stack of evidence-based documents and you don't want to hear it because you don't like it. He watches Fox and Friends. I mean, there's such a delta between the sources that he trusts and the sources that are truthful.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay, I think our work here is done. Let me tell you how I try to describe it in a more neutral way, all right? All right? Objective reality
This
is
is why
not...
none of them work
Yeah.
at MSNBC.
Objective reality is not the instinctive departure point for the president deciding what he does or say, what he does or says. It just isn't, all right?
But what does that do to the truth?
Well, I mean, that's the whole issue, isn't it? And someone else mentioned that, it may have been Jim, the president's product, not cause, all right? The president is an expression of a drift towards a post-truth world in American society, where as a society, we are far more willing to make decisions based upon emotion or preference or tribe or loyalty or grievance rather than data, fact, or evidence. And that's a broad spread expression. And the brilliance of the president was that he recognized that during the campaign and appealed to that form of reasoning. Now,
But is that brilliant or cynical?
It is tactically brilliant, and it is a rejection of the ethos of the Enlightenment that has governed the Western approach to decision-making since the 17th century.
Phil, bring us back to 2018, please. Let's leave the 17th century and all this new. Let's be blunt. I think something else Trump ushered in is an appetite for bluntness. And I think the blunt assessment that a lot of people have, Democrats and Republicans, is that Trump doesn't like the truth because the truth doesn't depict him in a particularly good light. His first fight was with the intelligence community, but by far he spent the most amount of time attacking the FBI and the Justice Department. What are they up to? Well, they're investigating his campaign, his family, and his White House staff, and him for possibly obstructing justice. So what do you make of his rejection of evidence-based disciplines like science, like intelligence, like law enforcement, and like journalism?
I think it puts a tremendous premium on leadership in a few key places. Department of Defense, that's Mattis, Secretary of State Pompeo, CIA Director Gina Haspel, who I know, she's terrific, and you have the Attorney General, regardless of your political views, he stood up to the president on the sanctity of federal investigations. This sort of sounds like a civics lesson, but as someone who served below the level of the other three gentlemen on this group, if you're in this kind of circumstance, leadership means two things at a premium. Number one, let me give you an example, Iran. If I'm working for General Hayden, the president is a million miles away. Boss, what are we doing? I know the president, I might have different perspectives on whether on his temperament and judgment. You're focused on what your leadership, whether it's the NSA leadership, Secretary of Defense tells you to do. I think the national security leadership right now is pretty strong, and people in this room and elsewhere ought to be watching when they change, because there is a lot of pressure on them to bring sanity to those departments that maybe, whether it's Obama or Bush or Clinton or Bush, maybe you wouldn't have that kind of pressure. The second thing I'd say is people like me in those jobs are looking at the boss, CIA Director, Secretary of Defense, and saying, I have trust in you on Iran, North Korea, for whatever the president decides to say on Twitter, to walk in the room and say, there's a stack of evidence about whether North Korea is doing anything on nukes or strategic missiles, and here's what the evidence says, and if you want to, not that you would say this, but if you want to fire me, fine. So the pressure on cabinet officials and people like the CIA director to manage the workforce and say, here's what we're doing, and to say, I will present the truth to the boss, I think is really at a premium.
Do we want to do a couple questions?
Yep.
Okay.
No.
No? Who said no?
The man of the people.
Okay. Let me take one from the overflow room. Hi, overflow room. All right. Okay, Amber Rogers, you noted that 2016 was not the first time the Russians tried to impact American elections. When did that happen before, and what did we do to respond to it?
Oh, I mean, we've seen the Russians, and Jim and Mike, feel free to chime in. Boy, we've watched the Russians for decades engage in this kind of behavior in terms of attempting to undermine the institutions of our nation. The thing that was different in 2016 to me was they just combined technologies with some very traditional tradecraft to really ratchet it up. And it had a breadth of impact that I just don't think that we had seen before at such a massive level.
Can I just quickly add? If we were to do what the Russians did, we would call it covert influence. Right. And I'd be the last one on stage saying we never done that, all right? But as a practitioner, covert influence never creates a fracture in a society. Covert influence succeeds when it identifies pre-existing fractures and then exploits them. And so the additional factor, in addition to technology, is the fact that we are a far more inviting, far weaker target in 2016 than we were in 84, 88, 92, 96.
Well, the big difference, I mean, we have records going back to at least the 60s where the Russians made some attempt to interfere in virtually every presidential election. But the big difference, as Mike indicated, is technology, specifically the massive and aggressive use of social media.
Facebook
that's a
and
big
Twitter.
difference.
Let me do one more from the overflow room, and then we'll get to you at the microphone. Let me take this to you, Phil. What advice do you have for current intelligence professionals who feel hopeless knowing their work will be disregarded by their ultimate customer, the president?
I don't understand the question. Why would it be disregarded? If you look at the national security issues we face today, whether it's sort of what's going on with unrest in Latin America, whether it's whether Iran is or is not complying with the nuclear agreement, whether it's what reconstitution or construction of nuclear and ballistic missile programs in North Korea, why would you sit back and say that my work is not valuable as a customer? It goes back a little bit to what I said before, your leadership. Gina Haspel at CIA, I guarantee you, is sitting there saying, I don't care what the president says, whether it's Bush, Obama, or Trump. I want to know exactly what our penetration is of the Iranian nuclear program, whether we can certify that they are not building a nuclear weapon and ballistic missiles that will threaten Europe and North America, yes or no? So
Let me defend the questioner. I'm sure this person
Damn it,
asked,
where is he?
Well, he or she is in the overflow room, so he or she is safe. I'll do what you guys taught me. I will protect my sources and methods. But I'm sure that people are worried that young people will be discouraged from this profession because they think that the president, by getting on Twitter and attacking the intelligence community, by comparing them to Nazis, by calling the Justice Department broken and corrupt, may be discouraging a young person who doesn't understand what you just described.
I would agree with that. I would say you cannot sustain.
And I did not write this question, by the way.
I think that's a fair perspective. If you cannot have a president of the United States calling the FBI leadership corrupt and referring to intelligence professionals as Nazis, and then go out on a college campus. And I did recruit at college campuses. The brand of the CIA, regardless of your political perspectives, was awesome. You go onto a campus and say you're going to take a 40% pay cut to come work for
Because of Carrie
Clark Fay.
Matheson, let's face it.
No, this is 1999. We didn't even have we had hardly had color TV. But my point is, I do think there's, over the course of time, and I'm talking years, you cannot have the leadership of the executive branch saying don't trust the executive branch. I would agree with that. But I would argue that that's going to that corrosion will take years. It's going to take this president. If we have a second president who starts to do that, my level of concern is going to jump dramatically because I'm going to start to say this must reflect what American culture thinks about the institutions of government, not what one president thinks about them.
And it seems important. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I would tell that young intelligence professional, remember, the criterion for us should not be, does the customer always agree with us? I have had plenty of times as a military intelligence professional where operational commanders I worked for said, Mike, I don't see it that way, or Mike, I'm not sure. Hey, if you could get me more in the following, you might convince me. What I always tried to tell the teams that I was a part of, you got to be prepared to live in a world in which some of our customers are going to have different views.
You know, I think it is worth remembering basics sometimes. You know, the oath of office that everybody takes. I solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, meaning the Constitution. And I think that thought, which is, you know, part of our history,
Nicolle,
is important to remind people of. I've done a lot of colleges and universities the last couple of years, And I find a lot of, still, a lot of interest in public service, in national security, and in the intelligence community yet today.
This is like
And
a
I
four.
bet you if you look, and I'm almost sure that if you look at the statistics on applications, they probably haven't gone down very much.
This is like a 4-chair turn on The Voice. Go ahead. This person in the overflow room, you got
I
all 4
agree.
of them on your
I
question.
agree with everybody. Jim's ethos, we can't stand this over multiple administrations. And Mike, I've had commanders who said, I don't agree with you. The distinction here, and I've written about this, and it's based on my conversation with PDB briefers, all right? That we've had presidents who've disagreed with us, and we've argued about the facts. We've had presidents who've disregarded our facts and lied. We've never had a president for whom the facts are not the departure point for his reasoning or decision-making. And I don't mean that to be judgmental, I just mean that to be descriptive. That is a fairly accurate description of this president. And that makes it very hard for the fact-based guys to influence. Doesn't change the ethos, doesn't change the oath, doesn't change our responsibility. But that interface between our gears spinning and the big gear in the Oval Office, sometimes the teeth don't mesh.
And I think we're going to have to end it there. We could go all night, and you all would probably love if we went all night, but we do have to let our folks free here. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience, a patient audience. We didn't get to as many questions and answers as we had hoped. There is a reception following. You will get opportunities to chat with some of these individuals. Some may have to leave sooner than others. But what I would ask everybody to do is if everybody could just stay in their seats for just a moment or two longer so we can let the guests on the stage and the first row or two of folks here, our distinguished visitors, to get out of the room and into the reception so that maybe you can get a drink before you corner them. And with that, thank you.
Thank you.